Thank you very much for having me. What I would like to do today is go through our website, give you just 5 minutes of introduction, and then perhaps discuss our 3 steps that we typically follow when we work on the reimbursement projects for our clients, if that's okay. So perhaps I can share my screen. Okay. Please just let me know if you can see our website.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So this is our website. We are, of course, a reimbursement consulting agency. I founded the company 15 years ago. And over the last 15 years, we have worked with more than 200 different medical device companies. Some of them, not all of them, are listed on our website. I hope you can see it. These are just the clients that allowed us to place their logo on our website. We have worked with companies from all fields of medical devices and drugs, apps, etc. Orthopedics, cardiovascular, ophthalmology, you name it. We cover 15 geographies, and those, we cover 15 geographies, and those include the US and Canada, as well as most countries in Western Europe. If we scroll down to the bottom of the page here, you'll see all the countries in Europe that we provide our services in, US and Canada, Israel, and Australia. I will go to our reimbursement services page, and this page shows the process that we typically follow on a typical reimbursement project. And of course, I'd be happy to take questions as I talk about this. So no need to wait until the end. So these are the 3 steps that we follow: reimbursement landscape, reimbursement planning, and implementation. We call them activities. And I will just spend a few minutes describing each of them. In reimbursement landscape activity, we don't try to change anything. We just try to understand how the reimbursement system in the targeted country, or the country you'd like us to look at, works with regard to your specific product. How the money flows, who pays who would have an incentive to pay for the use of a new device or a new technology or a new drug. We look at whether there are any existing similar products that are currently reimbursed in the market, and if so, what are the specific reimbursement mechanisms for these products? Are there any specific codes that are used for these products or drugs or apps? What payment rates are assigned to them? What are the coverage criteria associated with the use of such products? And if there are not similar products, are there any comparable products that we could use as a benchmark to see whether similar technologies are already reimbursed or have applied for reimbursement, and what were the results of these applications, so that we try to learn anything about the applicability of your product to the current reimbursement system in the country or countries that we look at. One of the results of this phase is to understand whether or not we will be able to commercialize your product in that country under existing reimbursement mechanisms, or whether we would need to develop new and specific reimbursement mechanisms for your product. Of course, there's a big difference between commercializing a product or a drug under existing reimbursement mechanisms or developing new ones. It could be the difference of a few years and a few millions or tens of millions of dollars. And of course, it is much more expensive and time-consuming to develop new reimbursement mechanisms for your product. The derivative of this work is to, or the final part of our reimbursement landscape activity, is to understand who would be the decision makers we would have to work with or convince to provide funding or reimburse your product, And it ends with a preliminary reimbursement strategy outlining the milestones, the pathway, the timeline, and even the associated budget of commercializing your product and obtaining the relevant reimbursement mechanisms in the countries that you wanted us to look at. That's the reimbursement landscape activity. If there are any questions about this activity before I go to the second activity, I will be happy to hear them. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
From your experience in terms of companies that prepare some of that stuff on their own, is there any type of material that they should collect in that stage of, when you call it phase of R&D, I believe? What kind of things should they kind of pay attention to and collect so they'll be better prepared for this reimbursement pathway?
Okay, first of all, it says here phase R&D because this is the phase of the company in which it is recommended to conduct activity one, because the results of this activity one might even impact the design of the developed product or the features of the product. So it should be done at a very early stage, even when the company is still in its R&D phase. Now, to answer your question, what they should be aware of, I think one of the most important things is to understand whether or not the product that you're planning to launch or commercialize could be commercialized under existing reimbursement mechanisms or not. And as I said, this would have a huge difference on the amount of money that you need to raise, your time to market, the amount and type of clinical studies that would need to be conducted. So it's a totally different company when you're considering commercialization under existing reimbursement mechanisms or developing new ones. We had some cases in the past where companies thought they would be able to commercialize their product under existing mechanisms and were later on found to be wrong, and that actually ended the company. The company closed because they were not prepared to do so. Now, I'm not aware typically of companies that develop their own reimbursement landscape activities. It's typically done by a consulting company or a professional. It's not something that you could find in some sort of a database. And therefore, I know I'm not very objective here, but they should turn to someone who knows how to conduct this reimbursement landscape activity, not necessarily Mediclever, but there are many companies who could do that and guide them through this process. And I think it would be very cost efficient from these companies to do so, because it could save them a lot of time and money afterwards.
Thank you.
I hope that answered your question.
Yes, absolutely, and I appreciate that. Thank you. I didn't expect them, companies like that, to bring this resource on board, because it's one of those classic things that one should outsource, right? I mean, you have a certain project, you have a high level of expertise that you want to bring in for a period of time that is predetermined. So these are all usually criteria to go and find the expert, plug them in for the needed task, and then it's not something that you need afterwards. So I understand that. I was just kind of trying to see what they can collect while doing that, in order to prepare nicely to the help that they'll get from the expert. And I understand that what you said is that they should kind of assess and understand their space, if you will, and how do they compare to the outside world, not only having head inside the company, but to some degree, some knowledge of the landscape, if I understand you correctly.
That is true. But to be honest, when we initiate the reimbursement landscape activity, there's not a lot of information that we need from the company at this early stage. So we just need some initial information about what they plan to be the product like, how would it basically work. We don't need to see the patent or anything, just to understand from 50,000 feet what the product is supposed to do, where will the product be used, in which clinical setting, whether it's a hospital or a physician's clinic or the patient's home, for example, and how it works. But that's all the information that we typically need as an input before we start the reimbursement landscape activity. But it all changes in activity 2.
Thank you.
In activity 2, we start thinking about what kind of data we would need to develop in order to convince those decision makers we identified in activity 1 to provide the funding or develop the appropriate reimbursement mechanisms for your product. And this breaks down to 4 steps, starting with a value story. A value story is it's a critical step in companies' process for reimbursement. It's essentially a document that depicts on one side what happens today for the relevant patient population, and what we believe will happen if they switch to using your product or drug, both from a clinical perspective as well as from an economic perspective. So what would be the improvement in the patient's net health outcome, and what would be the economic benefit? Hopefully, we will be able to show some sort of cost savings from the decision maker's perspective. And again, if the decision maker that we identified in activity 1 is a hospital, all of activity 2 would be done from a hospital's perspective. If the decision maker we identified in activity 1 is a payer or a health insurance company, everything we do in activity 2 will be done from the perspective of that payer or health insurance company or sickness fund, depending on the country that we're targeting. Again, at the end of the value story, we haven't proven anything yet. We're just laying our claims for the medical and for the anticipated medical and economic benefit of switching from the current pathway to using the new product. Based on this value story, we devise an economic model that not only quantifies the estimated economic benefit, but also allows you to conduct some sort of a sensitivity analysis, see what features or aspects of the product would be more important to support with evidence, or even help you to optimally price your product so that it would still be considered an economic benefit from the decision maker's perspective, while you're not pricing it too low. So we want to make sure that we know how to price this product in an efficient way. Next, we look at your clinical data, see whether some of the claims that we made in the value story have already been substantiated by your existing clinical data. And if you're planning an additional study, we will review the clinical study protocol and see whether we can leverage that future clinical study to generate the data that we will need later on for the reimbursement, for our reimbursement purposes. So what we want to do is leverage any studies that you're planning to do anyway in order to help us with the reimbursement effort. Once we have all of that, including our estimated results for the future clinical study, we go to the decision makers. We go to payers or hospital administrators, and we ask them a very simple question. Assuming we approach you in a month or a year with this clinical data that we estimate we will be able to achieve based on this clinical study protocol that we show you, and we will be able to substantiate claims 1, 2, 3 that appear in our value story, will you agree to pay us the amount that appears in our economic model for the use of the product? So basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to get some sort of a pre-ruling from our decision makers and ask them to validate our strategy and make sure that our clinical development plan is what they would need to see in order to make a positive decision. Otherwise, it's a gamble. We've seen too many times that companies decide upon a strategy, embark on a very expensive clinical study plan, and then once they have the result and they seek reimbursement, they get feedback from payers in the form of, yes, you seem like you guys are doing a good job, but you should have also looked at A, B, C, and D. Go back home, conduct another clinical study, and come back in 2 years. So in order to avoid that, we want to bring them to the table at a very early stage before we even have the data, just our plans for developing the data, and make sure that what we're planning to do is in line with their expectations. Just like you're going to the FDA before you've completed your clinical studies with your clinical study plan, and make sure that the FDA sees everything eye to eye with you, we want to do the same thing with the folks that are supposed to sign the checks later on and potentially reimburse your product. Are there any questions about this activity 2? Okay.
Well, if nobody asks, I will have a question. I found out that many people are familiar to a degree, not necessarily intimately, but with the pathway for regulatory, and less so with the pathway for reimbursement. Would you say that this is like a parallel universe, in a sense? Some of the steps that you're doing towards your regulatory effort are similar and parallel, but the entity that you're talking to at the end, looking together at the crystal ball, saying, hey, if we come in 18, 24 months from now with that model, with that tool in our hand, with that improvement of patient outcome, with that utilization or whatnot, because that part of the conversation is somewhat similar or parallel to the one with the regulatory, and you take it and then you put it in the right terms, and you know who to address at the reimbursement pathway. That's why in my mind, I think it's kind of somewhat of a parallel universe. It's just that we have to do them both. Is that correct?
Yes, it is parallel. The regulatory strategy would impact your chances to obtain reimbursement and vice versa. So the reimbursement and regulatory strategy should be synchronized from day one. However, the regulatory entity looks at different aspects of your clinical data than payers or health insurance companies. So you have sort of two bosses to please when you're planning your clinical studies, and you need to develop sometimes different types of data to cater to the needs of the regulatory entity or the payer. But as you correctly indicated, Arie, it's very important to make sure that your regulatory and reimbursement strategies are aligned. We've had some cases in the past that the regulatory strategy actually prevented us from obtaining reimbursement, and our client needed to go back to the FDA, change the wording on their FDA clearance in order to allow payers to cover the same product and reimburse it. So yes, it's a parallel pathway, but different aspects would be included in those two pathways.
Okay, so in the regulatory pathway, I guess we all know, there's one address, FDA, or in Europe, there's one address. I don't know what that is, but I guess there's one regulatory pathway in Europe. But how do you describe portraying the reimbursement pathway? I mean, you know who to chase or who to have those conversations with, and how do you establish the knowledge?
Of course. So in let's start with the U.S. With the U.S., we would speak with perhaps representatives of Medicare, which is the federal health insurance scheme for people at the age of 65 and above, and a few other people, and some of the largest private payers. We actually have on our team people who were medical directors for Medicare and some of the larger private health insurance companies in the US. So we obtain their feedback on a regular basis. And of course, we speak with many more representatives of payers. In Germany, we have on our team an ex-CEO of the largest health insurance company or sickness fund, Krankenkassen, as they call it in Germany. And the same applies in other countries in Europe. So we have direct access to those. Payer representatives in different countries around the world. And in any case, in every project, according to the specific product and the geography, are always being easily introduced to other payer representatives.
Understood. Thank you.
The last step is very binary, meaning it could be very short if we can commercialize the product under existing reimbursement mechanisms. In such case, activity 3 would only include 3A, actually. And this is where we develop a billing guide that would instruct healthcare providers how to bill for the use of your product or technology under the existing identified reimbursement mechanisms that are already in place. It's a semi-legal document that you post on your website and would instruct all providers how to bill for when using your product. Actually, it should be the only source of information for those healthcare providers regarding the billing and reimbursement of your product, so that no salesperson or anyone by mistake misleads them to conduct or bill using the wrong codes or anything that could complicate you later on. However, if we cannot commercialize the product under existing mechanisms, or we do not want to commercialize the product under existing reimbursement mechanism for any reason, then activity 3 is more like a marathon rather than a sprint, and may include all of these activities underneath here that may include funding of additional clinical studies by payers for their local jurisdiction, harnessing the support of the local medical community. In the interim period before we obtain formal reimbursement, initiating a program in which we apply for reimbursement on a case-by-case basis and appeal denials, if any, all the way to drafting applications and working with the local medical community to apply for the development of these new reimbursement mechanisms. And that this, of course, could take several years and cost much more money than commercializing the product under the any existing reimbursement mechanisms.
Yeah, if you have a good story for us that you can share, Amir, that'll be great.
Sure. So one example, a few years ago, one of our clients developed a product to treat chronic wounds. The product included a pump and their proprietary solution that ran over the chronic wound, and they were planning to show that they can expedite the healing of chronic wounds compared with the current alternatives. I met the CEO, who was very young at the time, and I said, let's do the activity 1, the reimbursement landscape. And he said, no, we know what we're doing. There are many other products in the market, and it's no big deal. 2 years later, he calls me and says, now it's the right time. We've already received our FDA clearance, and we're planning to launch this in the US when we want you to take care of our reimbursement activities. So we conducted activity 1, And we found that there are, in fact, existing reimbursement mechanisms for these such products, pumps that run solutions over chronic wounds in order to heal them. The problem was that there were existing reimbursement mechanisms in place, and specifically codes for those pumps, but the code descriptor, according to the code descriptor, the pump had to work at a pressure range of between 70 to 200. I think it was PSI. But their product, already cleared by the FDA, or their pump, operated at a pressure of 50 PSI. And therefore, they were unable to use the existing code because of the pressure range that appeared in the code descriptor. At this point, they had two options. Either they would work with the local medical community and perhaps change the descriptor of the existing code, which is essentially just like developing a new code, or go back to the FDA and ask them to change the product and then get it cleared again by the FDA, but this time the pump would need to work at a pressure setting of somewhere between 70 to 200. However, their investors were not willing to invest more money at this point to support either option, and therefore they never sold the product in the US. The company still exists today, but all they do is sell their proprietary solution, but they never sold a single pump in the US because this lack of reimbursement. Of course, had they done this reimbursement landscape activity in advance, changing the pressure setting from 50 to 70 or 80 or 90 would have been trivial for them, and they would have been in the market very quickly. So that's just one example. I've mentioned before that the company that their regulatory strategy prevented them from obtaining reimbursement. And in such case, this was a company that developed a set of electronic stethoscopes that could differentiate between two different lung diseases, asthma and COPD. However, in order to shorten their time to market, they approached the FDA with an intended use of monitoring lung sounds. And that was the intended use that the FDA cleared when they applied for clearance in the US market. Then when we started working on the reimbursement, and I specifically, and I spoke with several payors in the US, one of them just told me to my face, it is going to be a cold day in hell before we pay for this technology. And when I said, why? He said, well, why on earth should we pay for something that monitors lung sounds? What's the benefit in monitoring lung sounds? How does monitoring lung sounds improve the net health outcome of a patient? If you would have told me that your device could differentiate between two different lung diseases, therefore different treatment would apply, that would have made sense, and we would probably cover and reimburse it. But not with something that all it does is monitor lung sounds. And in fact, the company went back to the FDA, asked to change the intended use of their product. I don't remember whether they were forced to conduct another clinical study to do that or not, but they relaunched the product in the US with the different intended use just so that we would be able to obtain reimbursement for their device. So that's how the regulatory and reimbursement strategies impact one another and should be synchronized in a very early stage.
That's fascinating. I think that I'd like to know about you. You probably have situations that you don't deal with startups because your type of service required also by, let's say, if I have a 10-year-old company that sells in the US, and all of a sudden they wake up one morning and find out that, or think that Germany is a good market, or some other country that you cover. They then have to go through that same approach, right? Providing the same information, data. And so there are not necessarily any shortcuts here for an established company as opposed to a startup. Is that correct?
Sort of. We would need to do the reimbursement landscape activity from scratch in the new countries that they would like to target. Even if they are selling their product for 10 years in the US and it's fully reimbursed, and now they want to launch it in Germany or France or Italy, we would need to conduct activity one in those countries from scratch, because reimbursement systems are completely different in those countries. And unlike, by the way, the CE mark, which is shared by the European Union countries, the reimbursement system in each European Union country is completely different and unrelated to any other country. However, if they already have some of the documents that we typically develop during activity 2, we could use these documents when we either go to convince healthcare providers to use their products under existing reimbursement mechanisms, if we find any, or work with the local medical community in each country and convince payors to develop new reimbursement mechanisms for them. So if they already have some of the documents developed during activity 2, we could certainly use them in other countries.
Okay, just out of curiosity and as an anecdote, do you have any country or countries that you prefer because you say, wow, it's a different, easier process, or something anecdotally different in some countries as opposed to others?
So, as I said, we have worked with more than 200 companies, and 95% of our clients always start with the first 3 countries that are the US, Germany, and the UK. The reason is that, first of all, they represent relatively large populations, the US, of course, and then Germany with 80 million people and the UK with 60 million people, the largest in Europe, along with France and Italy. Second is because all these countries have in place mechanisms to encourage the introduction of innovative medical technologies before they are formally reimbursed. So they have mechanisms in place to pay and partially reimburse products before they complete the entire process of obtaining formal reimbursement. And perhaps the last reason is because each of these countries represent a different type of healthcare system. So we have the US with basically based on private health insurance with islands of national health service, like perhaps Medicare or the VA. We have on the other end of the spectrum, we have countries like the UK, Spain, Italy, Sweden, all represented by the UK with an NHS, meaning a healthcare system that does not depend on insurance at all, but on a national health service that is provided by the government, just like education, for example. So people don't pay health insurance companies in order to obtain health insurance, but rather pay taxes to their government, and some of this tax money is allocated to provide healthcare services as a service to all residents or all citizens. And in the middle, there are countries with statutory health insurance, such as Germany, France, Switzerland, the Netherlands. All are represented by Germany, in which there is a limited number of health insurance companies, all heavily regulated by the government, who provide health insurance or healthcare based on insurance collected from their beneficiaries, closer to the US model. In essence, these 3 countries represent the 3 types of healthcare systems operated in all developed countries, and therefore it's a good place to start in these at least 3 countries.
Understood. Thank you. Well, I've been the only one that asked questions so far, and I would like to open it again to the people in the room. If you want to jump in with a question or have a question that is on the chat. Okay. Ella has placed something in the chat. Absolutely. We will provide that. I think first of all, ULP can, Amir can, and I will make sure that I'll put the information. But I just wanted to say that thank you. I don't have any particular more questions, and it seems like this is the last one, so we might.
I can't hear you.
Yeah. Arie, it looks like you're.
I found out that, you know, it's rare to come across when you're looking for one. That's why I thought that this will be a useful help. We are surrounded and have quite a few regulatory consultants in the county, in Orange County. But it's great to have somebody like Mediclever that can support the activities that are needed. I just don't know. And so it's fantastic. So I really want to thank you, Amir, for providing that insight and information.